Welcome to CSIS Online. The way we bring you events is changing, but we'll still present live analysis and award-winning digital media from our Dracopolis Ideas Lab. All on your time, live or on demand. This is CSIS Online.
You know, Washington is pretty much caught up in a unified sense of worry and fear about China. And it's become kind of politically monolithic, but we don't feel that America has necessarily that same, kind of monolithic sense about China. And we wanted to understand how do Americans think about China? How different segments of America think about China? How does the business community feel about it? How do labor unions? How do university presidents think about it? So the purpose was to try to get better texture and understanding about how Americans outside of Washington really are viewing this new strategic competition that we have with China. And we've done that through a series of surveys as well as interviews. The team that's going to be presenting this to you today have been the leaders in this effort. Dr. Mike Green has been the leader of this effort. He's going to be taking us through the analysis that we've uncovered. Very interesting insights. And I'm really glad that all of you can join us. And Mike, let me turn to you. I look forward to hearing your presentation and all of our colleagues.
Thank you, Dr. Hamry. I'm Mike Green, Senior Vice President for Asia and Professor at Georgetown. I'm going to provide you with background on this project and share our top-line findings from the 3 surveys we did. And then I'll invite my fellow team members to give you their analysis of the survey and its implications for U.S.-China policy. You can participate by sending your questions to us via the event page at csis.org. And the website, which is an interactive website and has the results of our survey and analysis and also recommendations, can be found on chinasurvey.csis.org, chinasurvey.csis.org. It's up live now on the CSIS website, and it has far more richness and data than we can go through in our time with you right now. But we'll give you some of the key takeaways and talk about the implications with the time we do have. We undertook this effort with support from the CSIS board. It's one of the first of our strategic investment fund projects at CSIS. And the premise was that there is broad consensus in the United States and in Washington that we have entered an era of strategic competition with China. But what exactly that competition is supposed to look like? Where can we cooperate? Where do we have to compete? Where do we decouple? That's going to be a conversation and a debate that continues for some time. And our premise is that an enduring US strategy for a problem this big has to reflect the input and the values of the American people and of key stakeholders in the US-China relationship. So to try to get the contours of that strategy, we did 3 surveys. We conducted a public opinion survey across the United States with the help of Ernie Paikopoulos and Polity Research. We had a sample of 1,000 US adults, yielding a margin of error of plus or minus 3%, and controlling for 8 variables such as demographics. And you can find that at the project website. Then we did surveys of thought leaders, one in the United States. And to conduct that survey, we cooperated with 12 national associations in the United States in business, labor, university presidents, civil society, congressional staff, national security expert organizations, to try to get the views of stakeholders in the United States in the US-China relationship across different sectors. This is more of a qualitative survey. We couldn't control for who answered exactly the way you can with a public opinion survey, but it gives us a richer presentation of where key stakeholders are across different economic sectors, different parts of society, and expert opinion. And then the third survey we did was also among thought leaders in the foreign policy and international relations fields in 16 countries in Europe and Asia. And taken together, these surveys, we believe, don't answer every question we have about how to approach China, don't point to exactly the policy the US should have, but it shows you the contours. It shows you how an enduring strategy will have to be built if we're going to have buy-in from stakeholders in the US-China relationship on all sides of the issue, and key allies and partners without whom we stand alone facing China. So what I'm going to do now is ask Hannah Fodale to share screen so I can show you the top 5 takeaways from the survey, and then I'll turn to my colleagues for more analysis. So let me take you through those 5 top takeaways across all 3 surveys right now. First, a majority of the United States public views China negatively and believes by a wide margin that it is the country that poses the greatest challenge to the United States. 54% said China is the greatest challenge to us. Russia was a distant second at 22%, with North Korea and Iran well below that. Second, US, European, and Asian thought leaders in our thought leader survey broadly agreed that the best way to deal with China as a national security problem is through increased collaboration among like-minded states. 81% of US thought leaders across all sectors and 70% in Asia and Europe said that working with allies and partners to counter China is the most important approach, even if that approach hurts our respective bilateral relations with China. The US public was somewhat more divided, but a plurality, 45%, said we need to prioritize allies and partners over unilateral approaches or retreat. It's interesting because there was a time when Beijing proposed a new model of great power relations with the United States, a kind of bipolar condominium. But as you can see in our survey, only 4% of US thought leaders and 18% of the public agreed that we should prioritize cooperation with China, even if it hurts relations with our allies. So the era of the new model of great power relations is behind us. The bottom line here is that the United States should work more closely with allies and partners and internationalize, not unilateralize, the China problem. But it is noteworthy that respondents from Southeast Asia and some parts of Europe do want US international cooperation, but for their part, they prefer neutrality. But that would not be true of the major maritime democracies, such as Japan, Australia, India, and so forth. Our third major takeaway. We asked a lot of questions about economics, and my colleague Scott Kennedy can get into some of those, and you can explore them yourself on the website. But in that basket of questions, it was clear that technology competition is the greatest concern in all the surveys, with over 2/3 of thought leaders in the United States, Asia, and Europe supporting a ban on Huawei and other Chinese firms from their 5G telecom markets. This is different from the actual current policy of some of these governments, but a very robust 2/3 of thought leaders in the US, Asia, and Europe said ban Huawei and other Chinese firms from 5G. 71% of US national security and economic thought leaders favor banning Huawei and other Chinese firms. Only 6.5% suggest allowing Chinese firms to participate in our 5G market. And the consensus is similar about banning Huawei among thought leaders in Asia and in Europe. And as you can see on the circular chart on the left, among those countries with the most advanced components technology, such as semiconductors, fully 76% favor banning Huawei from their markets. And this suggests to us a very strong potential consortium of advanced industrial democracies that want a clean 5G network for their countries. As you can see on the right, the concern about Huawei is also shared among other allies and partners, with 56% broadly among the allies and partners supporting a ban on Huawei. More broadly, on economics, only 3% of US thought leaders expressed confidence that markets are the best way to discipline China's government and business sector. And views are similar among the US public and thought leaders abroad. About 2/3 of thought leaders in the United States, Asia, and Europe, together with a plurality of the US public, 35%, think the emphasis in economic policy towards China should be to use multilateral agreements to pressure Beijing to abide by its commitments or change its economic policies. Now, exactly what those multilateral agreements would look like, whether they're around technology, whether they're regional in Asia or include transatlantic agreements, that's a subject for a lot of debate. And we have some recommendations along those lines on the survey website. But clearly a multilateral approach to dealing with China economically is seen as the most effective among a very large majority of thought leaders in all sectors in the US and overseas. We also asked US thought leaders and the public about President Trump's approach to confronting China's economic policies, and 71% of thought leaders think the Trump administration's approach this is in the US, has damaged US economic interests without achieving positive change in China, 71%. Public is a little more spread out, reflecting polarization in our country. 42% of the public agreed, but the response broke down along partisan lines, with 44% of Republicans answering that the administration's policies have been effective in producing some tactical changes in Chinese economic policy. Say 57% of Democrats said that the Trump administration's approach has damaged US economic interests without achieving positive change. So there's a lot more consensus among thought leaders who follow China policy from different sectors and different perches, regardless of political affiliation. A lot more consensus than there is in the public, where the election pretty much shapes, I think, how people view that particular problem. Our fourth takeaway: most Americans are prepared to take considerable risk to defend US allies and partners against military threats from China. On a scale of 1 to 10, with 1 meaning take no risk and 10 meaning take significant risk, the mean response among thought leaders in the United States were all 7 or higher, and the mean for the public was 6 or higher. And we think this shows that thought leaders in the public are prepared to risk military conflict with China to defend our allies and partners. Thought leaders in the United States were somewhat less willing to take risk to defend an ally or partner if it happens in the South China Sea. In contrast, the public was most willing to take risk in the South China Sea, but we think this probably reflects how much the South China Sea is in the news today. For their part, most thought leaders in Asia and Europe are confident that the US would come to the defense of allies and partners in Asia, with a mean of 6.26, 10 being the most confident. I would emphasize that our East Asian allies, those that would actually come under attack, Japan, Korea, are the most confident. And it's our European allies who are least confident in our willingness and readiness to defend allies in Asia. But it's a high number either way. 2 other things to emphasize here. First, our allies on the front lines in Asia did have the highest confidence. European confidence was fairly low. So it suggests to us, and the number of the results do suggest this, that there's a gap in the transatlantic dialogue on China. Views are actually strikingly similar between American and European thought leaders. But what European thought leaders think the US will do is quite different from what American thought leaders think we will do with respect to crises in Asia. Now, what if there is a conflict? We asked national security experts, a group of our thought leader survey. We had over 400 thought leaders respond, and a substantial, about over 100 or so were experts in national security. We asked if there were a conflict in China, with China in the Western Pacific today, who would prevail? And the answer was 79% of national security experts in the US said the US would prevail. 84% of thought leaders in Asia and Europe said that. And again, the number of thought leaders in East Asia who said we would prevail was higher than the number of thought leaders in Europe, but quite high confidence, 84% the US would prevail. But in all the surveys in the US, Europe, and Asia, that number drops when we asked who would prevail in a conflict 10 years from now to 54, 55%. And this likely reflects concerns about China's military buildup, including efforts to develop advanced assets such as aircraft carriers, nuclear submarines, stealth aircraft, and hypersonic missiles. Confidence in the US is based on strong support for alliances working together, particularly among thought leaders in Asia. We should note that in our survey, most Americans and thought leaders in the US, but also in Europe and Asia, thought a war with China was very unlikely. Most thought it was possible, but unlikely. One interesting exception to that was Americans aged 18 to 30, where 50%, fully half, of young Americans thought a war with China, a conflict with China, was either inevitable or probable. Interesting demographic variation came out throughout the polling of the American public about China. We had 2 sets of policy recommendations that flowed from this. The US does need to strengthen its military capabilities, and we asked national security experts in what areas, and forward air and naval presence cyber capabilities, and upgrading command and control relationships with our allies in Asia all emerged as high priorities. Our fifth major takeaway from across the surveys is that there is robust support for advancing human rights in our policy towards China among thought leaders and the US public. As you can see, when asked on a scale from 1 to 10 how important it is to advance human rights in China, with 1 meaning not worth putting other priorities at risk, and 10 meaning worth putting other priorities at significant risk, there is strong support among the US, European and Asian thought leaders, and the US public. Among allies and partners, the country most willing to assume risk to advance human rights in China, specifically to promote human rights and civil liberties in Hong Kong, and the rights of ethnic minorities in regions like Xinjiang and Tibet, the ally most willing to take risk to pressure China is Japan. And France is most willing to do so to protect the human rights of Chinese dissidents. Overall, the results suggest there is a broad convergence on the importance of human rights, an issue that has often divided us in the past from our allies, especially after Tiananmen. And we think there could be a real opportunity now to develop an international framework for addressing China's human rights violations. Interestingly, 49% of thought leaders in the US favor combining clear criticism of abuses by China with targeted economic sanctions to advance human rights. 51% of those in the business community supported this, and in some parts of the business community that we surveyed, the result was close to 2/3 who supported targeted economic sanctions. In our survey of American thought leaders, those engaged in civil society and scholarly exchange with China are most hesitant to use sanctions to advance human rights, only 37%, with a plurality, 40% of leaders in civil society and scholarly exchange, including university presidents whom we interviewed. Only 40% preferred, the plurality, 40% preferred a combination of quiet dialogue engagement with some public criticism. Our read on this is that these professionals rely on access to China for their work, but are also more likely to see the possibility for change at a grassroots level through interactions across Chinese society. Overall, the convergence on human rights is a unifying theme, we think, that the US should operationalize by coordinating with like-minded allies on a set of actions that could be taken jointly to address violations by China of human rights, but there are important variations, as I just pointed out. So to conclude, this is just a snapshot of the top line takeaways from all 3 surveys. There's a lot of rich data on the site. We encourage you to burrow into the surveys. It's interactive. You can jump from a question and analysis on what European thought leaders think about human rights to what the American public thinks, and then jump right from that to our recommendations. Or you can follow it straight through from beginning to end. We've designed the questions so that we can do data visualization that allows the user to explore specific policy issues in a linear way, or to look at the survey separately and consider our recommendations. So let me now turn to the panel for some analysis. The team that pulled this together, in addition to Nick St. Cheney, who's our polling guru at CSIS and senior fellow, and Hannah Fordell, we had a team of China scholars and policy experts who helped design the questions, reach out to our national association partners, and prepare analysis and recommendations. So let me turn first for his observations to Jude Blanchett, the Freeman Chair in China Studies.
Thanks, Mike. And just a quick note, I know a couple of us have had a few emails that there are some folks experiencing some audio issues. I know we've passed those concerns on to our IT team, so hopefully those are worked out pretty quickly. But apologies for anyone who's not getting the full robust audio here. There's a lot of really fascinating implications that come out of this data. I think the fun thing for me, and I know everyone else who was involved in the project, is we really didn't know what was going to come out of this. It's clear to those of us working on these issues that we're in the midst of a fundamental realignment on what are the traditional demarcations, or what is the spectrum on quote China policy and China opinion. The old left-right consensus or continuum in domestic US politics is clearly evolving or breaking down, and we're in the midst of a paradigm shift where we don't have a new alignment, and that's what's made this period so interesting and challenging, especially from a policy and ideological perspective. But as Mike highlighted, I think we see a lot of outcomes here that both confirm what those of us analysts thought, and many outcomes that really challenge how we were thinking about these issues and where consensus may be. I just wanted to highlight one issue and then add a follow-on thought to what Mike just discussed in terms of the takeaways on human rights. I was really interested to see this issue of, we put forward a question of who's to blame for the current deterioration in bilateral relations. This is one I think folks following this and folks who are reading the big think pieces, a lot of these articles start out with the sentence, since Xi Jinping came to power in 2012, et cetera, really putting the onus on the rise of Xi Jinping. In contradistinction, we see a lot of the blame being put on the Trump administration and the trade war starting in 2016. And I think we're seeing a more nuanced picture emerge here of how the US public, thought leaders and allies and partners are diagnosing this. For allies and partners, it was interesting that it wasn't, the top choice wasn't the rise to power of Xi Jinping, but instead it was highlighting more structural issues. So first, this was a shift in power that made a confrontation inevitable. And related to this, in my opinion, was the second top choice, which was a more assertive Chinese military and foreign policy. What we weren't able to ask with granularity in this set of questions is, when did people date the beginning of this assertive Chinese military and foreign policy? But I suspect this is a shift that people see beginning in and around 2008, 2009, 2010, which again lends itself to this diagnosis that where we are in the bilateral relationship is really drawing on deeper tectonic plates, which slipped, so to speak, in and around 2015, 2016, 2017. That lends it to, I think, a belief that we're seeing a more enduring rivalry, and not one which will shift with a shift in administrations here in the United States. I would say a shift in administrations in China, but that ain't going to happen anytime soon with Xi Jinping in power. Looking at the more personalist elements here, when allies and partners are diagnosing which individuals are to blame, or what are the more near-term elements at work here, they seem to be, allies and partners seem to be pointing the finger at the Trump administration more than they do the Xi administration, with 50% of allies and partners pointing at the Trump administration for being the proximate cause of the downturn in relations, versus 35% who see the more aggressive Xi Jinping authoritarian playbook as the cause here. Contrasting that with US thought leaders, which, when given the ability to rank order three choices, the leading choice at 24% was the Trump administration, with China's assertive military and foreign policy coming in second at 15%. So here in the United States, we're seeing more an assertion that it's the Trump administration that is causing this than these structural forces. When we break that down, however, to different categories of US thought leaders, we see a more granular picture emerge, where human rights and civil society groups overwhelmingly see it's the inherent nature of the Communist Party of China which brought us to this moment of the deterioration of bilateral relations. In contradistinction, looking at civil society, educational and arts groups, the Trump administration is to blame here for the deterioration. What's interesting to me is that indicates that despite this narrative that there's a, quote, China consensus, we're still seeing a broad spectrum of opinions on what is the cause of this. And of course, if you have different diagnosis of the cause, you're going to get a different prognosis of what we should do about it. Cognizant of time, I just want to make a few quick comments on the human rights issue, which, as Mike highlighted, was a real standout in the polling results. And I think in really interesting, surprising ways, especially where we're seeing a strong support in the business community for sanctions. We asked a question on belief in how strong or how important democracy was for your own nation's long-term success. We asked this questions to allies and partners. We're in a time where we're seeing a rise in authoritarianism and a belief that we're seeing a decline in belief in small L liberal democratic systems. The results amongst our allies and partners, however, I think showed that there is a strong, robust recognition that democracy is a crucial element of success for nations. And real standouts here are Germany, where you saw 93% of respondents say, give this a 10 out of a scale of 1 to 10, 85% in Australia, 88% in New Zealand. And of course, these are three nations who are strongly facing off against or dealing with some tensions on China. Another takeaway for me is seeing the return of human rights issues as a center of US policymaking and discussion is really a return to where we were in the 1990s, where as we thought about how integrated should we be with China, again, we were thinking about accession of China into the WTO. Human rights was a central issue here. We were both responding to the atrocities of the massacre at Tiananmen Square in 1989, but there was the issue of Tibet was really strong in the national consciousness there, especially amongst some key members of, individuals in Hollywood. So this just human rights sat over the China issue. It was really for the business community to be struggling to break out of a discussion of human rights and talk about the benefits of integration. I see a return of that now clearly. And then final thought on this isn't going away anytime soon, this human rights issue. And that is because I think a few practical considerations. One is the trajectory of China is not going to shift anytime soon, again, away from this hard authoritarianism that is at the very core of the Xi administration. And second, China has gotten itself into a position in, let's say, Xinjiang, but increasingly Tibet, where I don't think they're going to be capable of forging strategies to de-escalate the ratchet effect campaign of oppression that they have put into effect there, which means Xinjiang and Tibet are going to be, and concerns about the human rights abuses there are going to be enduring issues. China is even with a lot of imagination, going to find it difficult to walk back or unwind this. And so pressure and external scrutiny, I think, is going to be an enduring feature. And because of that, a lot of the issues we've seen on supply chain scrutiny, on investors doing additional due diligence to find out if they have any investment exposure to Xinjiang, those are going to be enduring features of the business landscape. I'm going to unceremoniously shut up because I think I have gone long, but thank you, Mike.
Yeah, thanks, Jude. And the point about some of the granularity that we do have about who's to blame for the current U.S.-China friction, different differences among European allies, and big differences between Southeast Asia and Northeast Asia. These all suggest that the strategy is going to be have to be multi-directional with concentric circles of countries on certain issues. There's no broad NATO in our polling. There's a landscape of opportunity that has to be very carefully navigated, as Jude suggests. I have to apologize to those of you in the audience. We had a little bit of technical problems showing you the interactive website and video at the same time, and some people had trouble getting both. This is being recorded, and of course the website itself is up and running, and you can dive into it anytime. Let me turn next to Bonnie Glazer, Senior Advisor for Asia and the Director of the China Power Program.
So I will try to be brief, but I do want to start by highlighting the granularity of this data. As you start digging into it, there's really some interesting things that come out of it. Mike has already mentioned the difference in age cohorts, for example. Younger people between the ages of 18 and 30, 65% of them believe that U.S.-China military confrontation is either inevitable or likely. And that compares to only a total of 19% in the age cohort that's over 67 years old. So there's really a difference, and younger Americans also have a more positive view of China. There's also, and it questions that we asked where people identified their income bracket, for example. So income is a factor in the perception of the cause of tensions between the US and China. So actually 51% of people that earn under $30,000 or less view the pandemic as the primary cause of tension. But in the highest income bracket, over $100,000 a year in earnings, only 36% view the pandemic as the primary cause, and 39% view trade as the main driver. So as you really get into these questions, you can see some real interesting findings that come out of the data. But the point that really interested me the most was the attitudes of Americans towards taking risks to defend not only our treaty allies, but also Taiwan. And I'll start by saying that 1 year ago, the Chicago Council on Global Affairs did find in a poll that they conducted that only 35% of Americans would support US military action in support of Taiwan if China attacked. And so this was a question that we asked on a scale of 1 to 10, where 10 means it is worth taking a significant risk. And as Mike showed earlier in the data, we found really significantly high scores showing the willingness of Americans to come to the defense of Taiwan. The mean score was 6.69 for Taiwan, and that compared to 6.92 for Korea, 6.88 for Japan, and 6.38 for Australia. And an unnamed ally or partner in the South China Sea was 6.97. So almost really as high as Korea and Japan. I thought that was really interesting to me. And I think this is partly a function of growing concern in the United States about China and the Chinese challenges, threats, not only to the US, but of course also to our allies and to countries in the region. But even more than that, perhaps, it is, I think, a function of the growing awareness about Taiwan in the United States. Increased understanding, for example, of Taiwan's exemplary performance in fighting the spread of COVID-19, which, by the way, Taiwan has done without lockdowns and a very, very small number of deaths. And life is pretty normal right now in Taiwan, which it certainly is not in most places in the United States. So, I think that this is something that is a major shift we have now seen. And we found even higher support for defending Taiwan against military threats from China among US thought leaders. So those statistics, again, a little bit higher, 7.93 for coming to Taiwan's defense. So it's interesting to see that this support for Taiwan is much more substantial than it was even 1 year ago. And I think that should be reassuring to Taiwan and perhaps might also shape the policy of the next administration, regardless of whether it is a second Trump or Biden administration, about how to proceed in our policy toward Taiwan going forward. It affects, for example, the debate maybe over whether the US should continue to have a position of strategic ambiguity about whether or not it should come to Taiwan's defense if attacked. And I recently wrote an article that responded to a very important and stimulating article in Foreign Affairs by Richard Haas and his co-author. So this is a topic that I think will continue to be discussed for some time. I hope everybody will dig into this data a little bit more deeply. Thanks.
Thanks, Bonnie. Bonnie mentioned the really excellent survey work, polling work by the Chicago Council on Global Affairs. And many of you will have seen the recent Pew surveys on views of China. We have done our own surveys of thought leaders in Asia for 10 years now, every 2-3 years. So we have a pretty good baseline there. But we do, throughout the report, reference other polling data. to see how much our results track with the work of others. We have more detailed questions across more sectors on China policy by far, but we do try wherever possible to footnote and cite polls as Bonnie just did, so people have the context of whether ours is out of line with what others are finding. Let me turn next to Scott Kennedy, Senior Advisor and the Trustee Chair in Chinese Business and Economics.
Well, thanks, Mike. Let me offer a big thanks of gratitude to CSIS for supporting this project, to Mike for your leadership, and to Mike, Bonnie, Jude, and our other colleagues at CSIS who collaborated with us on this project. This is a strategic look at a strategic issue. On economics, what the survey shows is that we are in a new era. China says it's in a new era under Xi Jinping, and the US is in a new era on China policy. And the data shows a real spectrum shift of views in the United States and around the world on economic and commercial issues. Let me discuss briefly 3 takeaways from the data and a point about what the data does not address. So first of all, in terms of US goals, Americans and others around the world have given up on the idea that the goal should be to change China into a free market economy, to have its economic system converge with the rest of the world. Instead, 66% of US thought leaders from different parts of the United States emphasize that the dominant goal ought to be to have China abide by its international commitments. Only 14% say the goal should be to have China become a free market economy. That, though, I think we should understand is not suggesting that we want China to just follow the letter of the law. In fact, we want China to follow the spirit of the international system, including reciprocity. And folks don't want China to continue to game the economic system to their advantage. The second takeaway is what not to do. The survey shows that folks are really against a unilateralist approach to dealing with China on economic issues. 42% of the American public thinks the administration's unilateralist approach has damaged US economic interests. Only 10% believe the US actually has gotten any progress in pushing long-term change in China. 71% of US thought leaders have the same opinions, even more uniform views about this. In addition, though, folks are also against unconditional engagement and cooperation with China. There was very little support for this among thought leaders or the American public, and even with allies. Only 4% of US thought leaders stress that the top priority for US policy with China on economic issues should be cooperation. Instead, 81% stressed cooperation with allies and partners. And so, as Mike said at the outset, this is not a support for the idea of a new model of great power relations or an American equivalent. Third point, what should the US do? I think the survey, even though there's not a full consensus amongst different groups, gives a green light to what we might call a Goldilocks policy on economics. Hard-nosed, but willing to place discrete unilateral restrictions where needed, but not eliminating connectivity. Only 19% of US thought leaders and a similar number of the American public and thought leaders from Europe and Asia favor decoupling, full outright decoupling. Instead, folks are willing to have decoupling with a small d in very limited specific places, but broadly want to cooperate multilaterally and with each other in managing the China challenge. And so, as I mentioned, and so there is support, as Mike said at the outset, significant support for banning Huawei's telecom equipment from markets in the United States and other countries around the world. That was almost universally supported everywhere. It was surprising to see that this is not just an American concern. At the same time, you see very, very high support, 72% of US national security and business economic leaders for collaborating with others around the world, and the same for our friends elsewhere. So I think support for collaboration, but targeted sanctions and penalties, particularly in telecom. Let me say one thing, a little bit about what the data does not answer. The first is, how tentative is this consensus for a Goldilocks approach? I think this would be very, very tricky to pull off. It's going to require alignment amongst stakeholders in the United States, within the US government, and with allies. And as the data shows, in Congress, amongst human rights groups, labor organizations, and the public, they have more ambitious goals about and fears about China and less patience than other groups. We can also see that trying to thread the needle for a Goldilocks approach could become partisan. Right now, there doesn't seem to be as clear partisan divide on standing up to China, but when you say how to do it, you could see those partisan differences show through. In addition, countries around the world are not all on the same page. There are several countries in Southeast Asia, Italy, and the UK that want to remain neutral in a US-China slugfest. While on the other side, Vietnam and Taiwan, there's more support in both for decoupling because of the long-term concerns that they've had about over-dependence. And so we may aim for consensus on handling China, but we may end up with a workable coalition. And that's going to require a lot of effort on the United States. We're going to need to have a national dialogue on China, on economic issues, and actually, I should say, we're going to need an international dialogue. I think we're going to talk about several issues in that dialogue. How statist and dangerous is China's economy to the rest of the world? How connected are all of us to China? What are those benefits and harms that we face? What would be the net benefits and costs of decoupling and other policies? Because so far, we've not done the math on the costs and benefits of these different policies. And then, how are we going to cooperate with each other around the world, not just in an ad hoc way, not just between the US, the EU, and Japan during occasional meetings, but in a full, true coalition? We're going to need new rules, regional and global, to deal with the China challenge for a very long time. So I think that's what the data shows, and the challenge that it presents to us that we're going to have to work out in the coming months and years. Let me stop there. Mike?
Yeah, thank you, Scott. I think the line you used, we have an opportunity for a workable coalition, is the right way to put it. There is, on the whole, if you think of China policy as a kind of Venn diagram, there is on the whole much more overlap than not with allies and partners, and especially within the United States, a lot more overlap than one would think, given the current debate about China in the context of the presidential election. You would think, listening to our two candidates, that there's a fundamental division over China in this country. The survey suggests that on a thought leader level and on a public opinion level, that is not true, or to the extent it's true, it reflects partisan politics and the indictment or praise for the Trump administration's performance. So presumably after the election, we will be in a better position when the heat's down a bit to have the national dialogue Scott's talking about. And to talk about that and the congressional angle, I'm going to turn to Louis Lauder, our Vice President for Congressional and Government Affairs and a China scholar in his own right. Louis?
Thanks, Mike. I really appreciate it. I know we want to get to Q&A quickly, so I'll be brief. And yeah, I completely ascribe myself to the comments that you just made. I'm very interested in the politics surrounding China, and particularly on the Hill, where there's been a lot of work most recently. And yes, when you look at the campaign environment, you see at the presidential level, arguments over who is closer to President Xi. You see Cold War, type paradigm, Cold War type language, on the campaign trail, down ballot at the congressional level. A couple weeks ago, I was watching the Senate debate for the Arizona Senate seat between Martha McSally and Mark Kelly, and China was a prominent issue there. She was accusing him of doing business with China. He's a former astronaut. She accused him of bringing a flag that had a Chinese emblem into outer space. Very sort of heated stuff. In Congress, if you're looking at actual work in Congress, on the surface, it also may seem somewhat partisan. You have, there was an effort early this spring to develop a bipartisan task force in the House on China policy. That collapsed. Out of that came a Republican effort that actually came out with a report last week with a couple hundred recommendations. In the Senate, you have two separate comprehensive broad China strategy bills that were introduced in the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, one with Republicans, one with Democrats. So it looks like it's a fairly partisan dynamic, and that doesn't really jive well with the kind of consensus that we see, especially in the public opinion survey in this effort. But if you actually unpack that a little bit, you do see that there is quite a bit of consensus. Even on the in these partisan efforts, the two bills I mentioned and the task force report, there's just tons of policy overlap, especially in areas of working with allies and partners on economic and security issues, strengthening military deterrence, and on human rights and democracy. My colleague Scott Kennedy, who you just heard from, he's done some really great work on looking at what's been coming out of Congress legislatively, and he's tracked over about 366 pieces of legislation that are China focused, and I believe that was 12 of those bills have become law, which is significant in any Congress to have 12 bills on one issue become law. And all of those 12 bills had significant bipartisan support in those areas I discussed: human rights, democracy, working with allies and partners, military deterrence, and then some of the economic issues that we've been reaching here. So, why is there more consensus than it seems on the political trail? Well, it's because public opinion matters to members of Congress. And so I was really interested to look into the details of this survey, because you see, in some of the other surveys, you saw some broader sort of approaches to China, but here you got to really dig into sort of policy solutions. And it's interesting how where the consensus exists, that there's alignment in Congress in a bipartisan way. And you start with the 54% in the survey that that agreed that thought that China was the greatest challenge. That's and it was far more than, I think Russia was 22%. That shows that there's sort of a political push, a political force there, and it explains to some degree the amount of energy that exists in Congress to tackle the China challenge. 45% of plurality prioritize working with allies and partners on security issues. You see much of the work in Congress focus on that space. A willingness to take significant risks to defend allies and partners, a range of between 6.38 and 6.97 on a scale of 1 to 10 across, maybe looking at Taiwan, Australia, Japan, South China Sea. Strong support for taking some risk on that front, and you see significant congressional action in support of defending allies and partners, especially Taiwan, which has always been a large priority for members of Congress as an institution that advocates for Taiwan. And then on human rights, a mean response of 6.79 on a scale of 1 to 10 to take risk to support human rights when it comes to China. And you see tremendous activity on human rights in Congress, including significant legislation that has recently been passed both on Hong Kong and the situation in Xinjiang. So the one area I would say where there's more division and it leads to sort of more questions for the future is on the economic front. In our survey, there was a bit of a split on prioritizing between using international agreements and rules to compete with China, or pressure China, or using more unilateral tools. I think that division you see in Congress as well. But what you see right now in terms of the legislative activity is consensus around kind of broader issues of increasing domestic competition. There's general support for working with allies and partners, but no rubber meets the road decisions quite yet. Certainly supply chain security is growing important. It is an issue growing in importance there. But it's not the typical divisions you see over trade haven't developed yet, though that could certainly happen down the road. The last thing I just want to mention is, if you look at Congress 15 years ago, 10 years ago, there was a smaller group focused on China policy, but there was a significant group. But you could divide them up in different camps. You had the security-minded military side. You had human rights activists. You had the free traders. You had the economic nationalists. But we see today is sort of a convergence on China policy with all those groups. There's a common recognition of the challenge, and there seems to be broad agreement on solutions in some areas. What will be interesting to see down the road is whether new groups may emerge once the policy evolves. If there's a new multilateral, if a new administration comes in and there's a new push for a multilateral trade deal in Asia, will that create new divisions? If there's an effort to cooperate more with China on climate change, will that create new divisions as well? So, there's a lot to still learn, but I think there is really interesting alignment between public opinion and what Congress is working on, which I think will extend past the campaign season when some of the more partisanship that we see these days recedes. So with that, Mike, over to you.
Yeah, thanks, Lee. Let me get to some questions. One participant asked about the new North Korean missile they showed off in Pyongyang yesterday, and whether the survey tells us anything about U.S.-China cooperation on the North Korean problem. In fact, we did ask a number of questions about where the U.S. should be cooperating with China. And in the rank order of those issues, climate change is number one by a pretty wide margin, followed by global health for obvious reasons. Scholarly exchange, North Korea is number 4. Only 9% of respondents thought it was the most important issue. When I was the senior Asia person on the NSC staff in the Bush administration, I think that would have been the number 1 issue 16 years ago, 15 years ago. But it's not now. So Bonnie, if you could pick that one up for us. What do you see in the survey, and what do you see as the prospects for U.S.-China cooperation on North Korea?
Well, you have the data handy on this. I do not, but I do recall that younger people are far more concerned about North Korea. So going back to the issue of the differences between younger and older people, we of course had 4 different age cohorts. But it was interesting to me that North Korea was a greater concern for younger people. But I think that in terms of the prospects for cooperation, there is a potential for a Biden administration. And I think actually the vice president has said, although not recently, but I think early on during the primary, he did say that the United States should work together with China to try and denuclearize North Korea, that China is a player, basically. It can't be ignored. And maybe the Trump administration, if they get a second chance, will try to re-engage with Kim Jong-un and will see that China has perhaps more just a disruptive role to play rather than a cooperative role. But I think it's clear that people are going to be more concerned about North Korea if it starts ramping up its testing, not only, of course, potentially ICBM tests, but also potentially resuming nuclear tests. And if we were to conduct this survey at a time when North Korea is increasing its tests, we might find that it is a higher level of concern among all age cohorts.
Thanks, Bonnie. We had a question also, and I'll let Jude start on this one, but somebody asked, the survey shows a pretty robust appetite among the American thought leaders to push back on technology and on human rights and to defend allies. And we did this survey so people know in the first half of August. But the question is, is this sustainable with all the bruises the U.S. has taken from the pandemic and the economy? Is this really what we're going to look like in a year? Are we going to have the wherewithal to compete? I'll let Jude start on that one.
Yeah, thanks. That's a great question, and I think one that looms and lingers over the United States. One of the interesting things coming out of the pandemic is this has, in terms of propaganda in Beijing, they're leveraging this as showing the inherent superiority of the political institutions overseen by the Communist Party of China, in distinction to what they see as the inherent failings in Western liberal democracy. I think looking at where the framing of the question that was just asked to us, I think it's really a matter of focus by the United States and allies on where and how we push back. I think just building on the question that was put to Bonnie on cooperation and where we're going to see concerted pushback, one of the muscles we're going to have to develop here is twofold. One is thinking about how we align with allies and partners on some of these key areas beyond the simple bumper sticker of working together with allies and partners. We've been hearing that for years now. The real tricky thing has been, although the survey results show that we have some pretty robust alignment on issues, we're still struggling to find traction on how specifically we thread the needle on some of these thornier issues where we're not facing binaries of full ally support versus opposition. We have a spectrum of where allies and partners stand on some of these really thorny issues, especially when they have to do with economic trade-offs, as we see in the case of technology, trade, and interdependence. This is not a binary. Folks often want to fall somewhere on a spectrum. The second muscle I was going to say we need to develop is, you hear climate change as being one of the areas where the United States needs to cooperate with China. There's a couple difficulties there, but I think as just one framing or big thought is, we need to think about how we will actually cooperate with this administration in Beijing when we have rivalry in so many other areas. So this is going to be a new type of cooperation, and how do we bucket, cordon off cooperation on, let's say, something like climate, even if there were an alignment between the US and Washington on that, when we have so many other frictions in the relationship. And also we have to remember that even on climate change, which is often the one kind of fill in the blank, where will we cooperate? China's got more coal-fired capacity under development right now than the US and India. China's doubling down on digging up out of the ground and burning hydrocarbons. So even when we hear China sort of put forward an appetite for cooperation on climate change, it's dealing with the exigencies of economic growth. And I dare say competition with the United States will, if anything, incentivize China to boost economic growth come hell or high water. And so that may put climate change cooperation at risk. So I think, we still haven't, even if we want to cooperate with China on cooperation on climate change, we have just an extraordinary thicket of issues we need to wade through before we can get traction there.
Thanks. I think the next one's probably for Scott. We'll have to be brief because we're getting to the end, but somebody asked, with billions flowing into the Chinese bond market and US industry revolting against trade sanctions, especially in 5G, isn't China going to win the tech war? I would just say, in terms of the results of the survey, we did see a very consistent, 2/3 across all the surveys among many sectors favoring banning Huawei and Chinese companies from 5G. But when we asked specific questions about export controls in tech, it was much more mixed. Somewhere around a third to 40% supported that, and most of those were not in industry. So I think the answer is, doesn't it look like industry doesn't agree with these survey results? Actually, I think this shows you exactly where industry is. They are prepared to ban Huawei. They just don't want to do it alone without allies and partners, and they don't want to do it in ways that are, rushed and damaging to them. But I'll turn it over to Scott about who's going to win the tech war in 90 seconds or less.
Well, the survey tells us what people feel. It doesn't give you an objective analysis of what the balance sheet is in the record. It obviously shows a great deal of concern, and the media and others have been paying a great attention to China's high-tech drive, and the Chinese are good propagandists as well. I think the U.S. is in still pretty strong position across most industries, particularly when you throw in our allies and partners in Asia and Europe. But yes, the Chinese have made a lot of progress. They're no backwater at all, but neither are we, and we still have a lot of juice in this engine. Nevertheless, this is a real competition. The Chinese are making significant progress, and we are not going to continue to move forward unless we really focus. And part of that is about having a textured policy on export controls and investment restrictions, decoupling with a small d, but it also means greater investment in U.S. industries. We didn't really ask much about industrial policy, but that's a word folks hear more today. Louis' colleagues that he talks with on Capitol Hill talk more about industrial policy across party lines. And so we're going to hear about that. I do think what is interesting is that we've lost a little bit of the dialogue and idea that interaction with China is good for our high-tech drive as well and for theirs. And so we're going to need to be able to find where can we continue to collaborate with China and do business with China, even in high-tech, and protect our national security at the same time, and also protect ourselves against Chinese theft of IP, et cetera. So again, it's about threading a needle, finding some type of Goldilocks policy. And I think there's going to be an effort for that. And if we can't, then we will default, then turn to a much more harder line. There's plenty of bills sitting on Capitol Hill and ideas waiting to be executed in the executive branch, upping pressure, not cooperation. So I think it's either going to be figuring out how to walk and chew gum at the same time, or just going in a much more hardline direction. And either way, it's a huge challenge for us.
So very last question I'll slip in, since this is the political system season. One person asked, what are the implications for a potential Biden administration? And I think there are some. I'm not advising the Biden campaign, but there are a couple of things I would look at if I were thinking about a possible Biden administration. Overall, we asked in Europe and Asia which candidate would be better positioned to deal with China, and 61% said Donald Trump, 61% said Joe Biden, 18% said Donald Trump. Not a single European, we had 450 responses, I think, not a single European said Donald Trump would be better. So pretty strong endorsement of a Biden presidency to deal with China, but there's some big caveats and things a Biden administration would have to think about. Number one, while most people blame the current friction on the Trump administration, it's pretty clear in the numbers that they do not think that means that China as a problem will go away. There are pretty fundamental issues on human rights, on security, and on tech that are going to still be there. Number two, as we've been discussing, there is an overlap in the Venn diagram. There is a basis for building coalitions, plural, on issues, but it's not just going to suddenly appear magically. Allies are important, but allies are in some ways still all over the place on certain issues, and it's going to take a lot of hard diplomacy. I think people will realize that. And then third and lastly, there were two countries where thought leaders believe that a second Trump term would be better in terms of dealing with China, and those were India and Vietnam. And if you think about it, those are the two countries that are getting hit the hardest by China right now in terms of coercion. And next below them was Taiwan, where there was a narrow preference or narrow belief that a Biden presidency would be better China. So I think the fact that those on the front lines are more skeptical about a Biden administration should be something that a Biden team would want to think about. And how do they convey perhaps more, these are not treaty allies, India and Vietnam, but they're important partners and they're on the front line. So how a new administration, if it's a Biden administration, would convey a strong sense of support for an open Indo-Pacific and against coercion. It's an important question because people in Vietnam or in India are asking, and they're the ones most under the gun. But again, this is not a predictive survey. It's a serving suggestion. It illustrates the contours of coalitions at home and abroad to manage China policy. Some of the thinking about the mix of competition and cooperation, and really the basis we hope for a national dialogue and a dialogue with allies and partners about how to get a strategy on China that's enduring and that maximizes our interests and stability and prosperity in the world. So with that, I want to thank my colleagues across CSIS for all the hard work. Thank you for joining us. The site's up. Enjoy. You can explore it any number of ways, but that's all up to you. And we look forward to your feedback and ideas for the next round of this. Thank you again.